performance this morning, if you don't mind. Exactly. I don't think it's well. I think we're in the job.
Right. Kia ora, everyone. Councillor Hopkins, we're live. Thank you. Welcome along to the Extraordinary Community Culture and Regulatory Committee meeting. We're discussing the spatial plan today. First of all, I'll call for apologies. I think we have any declarations or interest? No, so we'll move on to the decision reports, which is the Oamaru, Western and Kakanoa spatial plan. And I'll just pass over to Mr. Cook to start things off.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm quite excited by the next 2 hours. This has been over a year in the making, this spatial plan. And I firstly want to thank everybody for their contribution to it, the councillors, community, and in particularly the staff and the contract team that have worked on this to get us where we are. Very proud to bring it to you and look forward to your recommendation at the end of the meeting, hopefully, that Council adopted on the 10th of May. It is a very important milestone as well because it marks the first step in the sequence that will see the draft district plan move forward, and that is a very significant piece of work for Council and for the team as well. We have a few points to discuss today, and we need to take them in a very staged and well-ordered fashion, because the governance advisor will need to record them, and it will become quite a mission if we go all over the place. We have Ruth and Briar from Barker's online, who will be there to support the team if we need more detailed information around any of the points. But it is the intention that David and Katrina between them will introduce the topics and respond to the questions in the first instance today. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, welcome along to Ruth and Briar, and thank you for all your work on this document. So just so we know what we're doing, councillors, we're going to be going through, first of all, the officer recommended changes to the spatial plan, so we'll take them one at a time. If there's any questions on each point, I'll get Katrina or Rachel or David to outline the change a wee bit. And essentially, we want a bit of direction on the officer recommendations, so that's right through to number 11. And then if there's anything else that's not been addressed that you're concerned about, then we'll cover that after that. So is there any questions on the process there, councillors? Nope, perfect. We'll move on to the officer recommendation number 1, which is the update of the growth projections. Is there anything you want us to say to start this off? Katrina.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, just really to give you a brief sort of rationale behind why we've made that recommendation. Essentially, prior to the work on the spatial plan being undertaken, we had some census and population growth projections which have been prepared by a consultant for us. But at that time, not all of the information from the census 2018 had been released at that stage. Since the draft has been prepared, further information has been released and we've been able to revise those projections. But I guess in essence, it's important to note that those updated projections are inconsequential in terms of the currently identified growth requirements. So there are no changes to those growth expectations in the longer term. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Right, councillors, is there any question on that? Councillor Hopkins.
Well, yeah, I suppose the question is whether or the basis on which you say that the updated projections are inconsequential in terms of the currently identified growth requirements, because it did seem to me that they are actually quite consequential, really. I mean, we're saying we only need, well, the new projection is we'll need 1,900 new dwellings over the 30-year period, not 2,750. My calculation is that 1,900 over the 30 years means that we'll need 63 houses a year, or 1.2 houses per week, which isn't a lot, I would have thought. and doesn't point to something, being inconsequential. I would have thought that's a quite significant reduction in the growth projections.
Is that a question? Was that a question there or?
Well, yes, I mean,
Yes, when I say I would have thought that's a quite significant reduction of the growth predictions and less, if you like, threatening or intimidating. What's your reaction to that? Why have you said that the updated projections are inconsequential in terms of the currently identified growth requirements?
Mr. Campbell.
Thank you. I guess there's two parts to it. One is the first set of projections is the shorter term to 2031, which is a very small drop. Yeah, from 200 to 2010. So that's probably the more immediate one that we need to think about. So that creates the shorter term demand. Once you start pushing up beyond that, the projections naturally become a bit more conservative and are over a longer period. So they're subject to probably more change depending on growth rates and what happens. So we're less concerned about the longer term projection because there's probably a higher margin of error in that and it's over a longer period.
okay.
So I think we can say, look, it could be higher, but we're saying conservatively it's probably a bit lower given the overall trends we've had in growth up to this point. We're just in a bit of a sort of blip at the moment, which probably reflects the shorter term projection versus longer term. It's probably going to flatten and stay steady. But this will always be reviewed anyways, the spatial plans, so you can come back and relook at them as well.
Yeah, I guess there's 2 points there that we can revisit and we will keep revisiting. This is not going to be a static document. And the other would be, I guess, are we comfortable with updating the projections based on the 2018 census as recommended by staff? And if that's the case, like there might be questions throughout the other parts of things as to whether or not that takes into account the new growth projections. But essentially, are we comfortable with what officers have suggested? Councillor Hopkins.
Gosh, I suppose the question is then, how much weight do we wish to put on the 2018 census? Because it was so manifestly flawed and the government itself has acknowledged that. Do we want to rely on that as our foundation document for growth projections, or are there other options that we could include or substitute for it? Because I would have thought that census is badly flawed, was badly flawed.
Councillor Halalali.
I would agree with Councillor Hopkins. That was a significant undercount, like in our community, and particularly our Pasifika community that has a different age median compared to other groups. We have a very fast youthful population. You can see it in the schools. So yeah, I'm not too sure that sits comfortably with me in terms of those projections, whether it's been accounted for in those demographic spaces that it needs to be accounted for.
I guess I'm probably looking to officers for a little bit of guidance here. Obviously, there was also a number of submissions that came back through that questioned us using sort of higher growth. So this could be looked at as being a bit more of the medium growth. But yeah, I'll pass to Katrina if you want to expand.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to acknowledge that the first, when the initial projections were undertaken, we used a combination of census data, and also we did talk to Helen Algar as well, and we acknowledged that there was an underrepresentation from some sectors of the community. So that was addressed in those projections, along with actual building consent data. So it was supported with other data and other information out there. It's not been solely relied, we haven't solely relied upon census information. It's been it's informed what the projections are, but the projections have been based on a number of other reports as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Halalali.
Does that include the Ministry of Education numbers for the school rolls in the Waitaki region? Because I have updated figures here.
Ms. Katrina.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can't answer that directly at this present stage, but I can certainly find that information out. We can feed that back to you, yes. Thank you.
And perhaps that's information that before we finalise and when we do, this recommendation is going to be through to council, so there might be some opportunity to feed that information back through to councillors. And if there needs to be any tweaking to things moving into the council agenda, we can approach that then potentially. Right, so we'll feed back a bit more information on where the figures came from and whether they do include that. And Councillor Halali, if you want to share that information with officers, would be really helpful as well, just in case it's not something they've got. Fantastic. Number 2 was use of plain English and provide links to definitions where possible. I'm guessing there's not going to be a lot of pushback on that. Councillor Hopkins.
I did have a question, which was simply if we do this, and I presume that you guys are suggesting that there could be another revisiting of the spatial plan principle to see if any increased use of plain English is possible. I suppose the real question is that do you have any anxieties about changing the meaning of the principles? I suppose that's the one risk, isn't there? If you change the words, do you potentially run the risk of changing the meaning?
I'll attempt to answer that if it's a question, but I guess you'd have to look at it and say, well, as long as the wording didn't change the meaning, then we'd make the change. If it led to a doubt around what it might mean, or if it seemed to change those, we'd probably come back to you and say, hey, is this actually what you want? But it's just a filter really over that.
So I guess a rider on that one could be with any changes approved by councillors or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Right, we'll move on to number 3, which is remove the proposal to explore alternative uses for council land and reserves. So this was certainly an area that had a fair bit of feedback. Fair to say. Does staff want to say anything to that for a start? Thanks, Katrina.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I mean, as it says in the report here, there was clear community feedback from a large number, not all, but a large number of respondents that alternative uses on reserve land was not something that they supported. So hence the recommendation is that based on that feedback, the proposal to explore alternative uses for council land and reserves is removed from the spatial plan.
Right, Councillor Halali.
I just want to inquire, so if there's extra land or spare land that's not used by council that we want to look at a housing project for, is that off the table if this is removed? I don't want to be hamstrung if we want to be running projects in the community to be able to provide accessible, healthy, warm, safe houses for a demographic in our community. If this prohibits that opportunity, I'm just acknowledging that people that probably fit in live in warm, safe houses already.
Trina.
Thank you. If I can, I'll just respond to that in terms of the fact that this is not, this is a guiding document and just sort of sets out high level objectives and sort of direction of growth. So it's by no means binding and it is a living document as well. So there is provision in there to review the document.
And I guess it's mentioning reserves, and I guess it's whether or not council land in there throws a bit of a red herring as to the use of non-reserve areas. Councillor Wallstein, did you have your hand up?
I did, thank you, Madam Chair, but my point was exactly what you just said. So you've just answered my question for me. I just think in the heading, remove the proposal to explore alternative uses for council land and reserves, when they'd only talked about reserves, not council land.
Councillor Hopkins.
Well, yeah, look, to me, this is a critical one because quite apart from the fact that in terms of the submissions, it looks to me as though implicitly Kainga Ora possibly supported the original proposal to perhaps use underutilised parts of underutilised reserve or council land. I would just make the point that when you look at this document, there are basically 14,000 people in Western Kakanui and Oamaru. Of that 14,000, 278 people submitted on the spatial plan. By my calculation, that's 0.01% of the total population. 201 people in Oamaru submitted. 195 responded to the reserves land question. 165 said no, they didn't want it, and 30 said yes, they did. So I do not believe we should shackle ourselves and future councils for 30 years on the basis of 165 people saying no to a question that I think was either unintentionally or deliberately misinterpreted and misunderstood.
So Councillor Hopkins, we're probably not debating right now. I think there will be a chance for that, and I'll put these separately to give us an opportunity to do that.
I suppose, yes, but I'm simply, if you like, echoing, Colin and Hannah have asked a question.
Yes.
And okay, if you want questions at the moment, my question to officers is, we have had a workshop looking at initial responses to the spatial plan. And my recollection as to the outcome of that workshop was that the response to the question, what should we do with underutilized reserve or council land, was that we would say, the spatial plan would say, there are no plans to use this at the moment, but it may be considered by future councils. So I thought the proposal that emerged out of the workshop was slightly more conditional than remove the proposal altogether. And I'm just wondering why it's back to remove altogether when I thought we'd moved a little bit away from that position in terms of our own conversations.
I just from my recollection, and I'll pass anyone else that has a different or similar one, but it would be that the discussion around Kakanui was that more work to be done. Around the reserves at the stage, it was to remove entirely, because essentially, if don't shake your head, it's not helpful, but the spatial plan is a moving document, like we said. Right now, we're talking about this space and time and looking forward. In the near future of this document, it's being said here that there was not support for that. And so that there needs to be a case brought that has the community support for it to change within the document. But I guess I'm still looking to staff just to get an idea of the addition, as I said, of the council land rather than just covering council reserves. Does anyone want to comment on that at all?
I think the consensus seems to be that there might be a slight typographical error made in that, because the explanation underneath clearly identifies reserve land is not supported, so we can certainly correct that.
No, that's great. So I'm going to put through council land and just leave it as council reserves for when we get the chance to discuss this a bit later on. Any other questions on Mr. Campbell?
Thank you. Just noting that the commentary talks about the changes made to the spatial plan document. So what it would do is remove the potential residential zoning on those areas of land shown on the maps. And then also there was an action plan which had a specific item, was number 51 in the action plan, which is on page 89 of the
We won't try and get councillors to go to pages.
No,
I think it's just too complex on the.
But what it talked about was study of council reserves to explore community feedback on alternative uses, in brackets such as residential over, and it listed the reserves. So essentially what we're saying is that would come out of the spatial plan as a action point. So it doesn't preclude alternative uses being looked at, because there's still other action points around, reserves management plans, that type of thing. So it's not taking those things off the table as such. It's just saying they're not an action point in the spatial plan.
It's not a direction that we're giving to officers moving forward, but if there is something different, that's got to be a mindful decision of council that is moving away from the direction of the spatial plan. So you need to build in what you do around that.
So it's key to say it's just saying that option is no longer one we're going to pursue, but it means we can go back and look at it in some other way.
Okay, understood. Right, if there's no other comments, we'll move on to number 4. which is update the action plan to be more specific regarding additional work required in relation to potential youth centre, investigating possible locations, additional targeted engagement, including Youth Council as a partner agency. So I think it's just saying essentially that there's been a bit of support for that through this discussion, but we're not ready to say where that could be and things, and that will be fed into a future iteration. Any, Councillor Hopkins.
Well, yeah, look, sorry, this is not a question, but it is an observation. And it points to the fact that there is merit in the question Hannah and Colin asked. And it also points to the fact that people are perhaps a little bit confused in terms of what they want, because one of the things that emerges from the submissions regarding the youth centre is that people are quite happy to have the youth centre built on a reserve. You know, Awamoa Park is proposed, the skate park is proposed. So all I would say is that if we want to have honest conversations with the community about, and other submissions talk about affordable housing and the like, then we have to say to people, these are, all the options need to be open, because otherwise we just price ourselves out of a whole range of markets and opportunities. So I simply note the point that everyone said, yes, well, we wonderful to have a youth centre. We haven't costed it. We haven't looked at whether it can or clash with the sports and events centre. People are blithely choosing places like Awamoa Park to locate it. It can stay in, it can remain in the action plan, but it does point to the fact that we probably do need to have more detailed and if you like, more honest, arguably confronting conversations with the community about how we pay for the things we want, or they tell us they want.
Certainly take your point, and I think that the discussion around the reserves just shows that if there is any step away from the direction that spatial plan is going in currently, that it needs to be mindful, it needs to be well explained, and it needs to have a fair bit of information underpinning it. So that's probably where we're at, which is why we can't put a place or anything around the youth centre. It's saying essentially investigate, a bit more information on there. And I think it's the same for any use of council land, that there's basically an understanding that people aren't wanting carte blanche. They aren't wanting to say to council, go for it. Our reserves are up for grabs. So we're very clear on that. And so that would probably speak to me personally that there'd need to be some kind of process that involves the community and explaining it to the community and getting their buy-in before anything changed to that effect. Microphone if you'd like to talk. Thanks.
165 people were clear about what they understood, in fact misunderstood about reserves. 14,000 people were affected by this plan. And there's an argument for saying that the next 30 years shouldn't be shaped by 165 people.
Again, 2 points there. One is that this is an ongoing plan. This is the first iteration, and it will change as our community evolves. It's looking to, forward 30 years, but the next sort of 10 years are the ones that we can really influence. But also just recognising of everybody that did respond, I don't think they'd like to be seen as being incorrect or misinformed. I think they had their opinions, and I think we've got to be very careful how we approach that. If you're saying 165 people's points of view don't matter, then what's the point in submissions? So moving on from that, we can discuss the Youth Council when we get to it, but I don't think there's a lot of pushback on the actual terminology used in the officer recommendation. So we'll move forward into number 5, which is remove the indicative southern location for a centre in Kakanui in the draft spatial plan, retain the option for a centre on the north side of the river. Any questions on that one, councillors? Right, we'll move on to number 6, which is review zoning at Kakanui. The draft district plan will use a mix of general residential and local centre zone rather than the settlement zone, which is the existing township zone. Any questions on that, councillors? So, Councillor Hopkins.
Well, I suppose my question would be, are you satisfied that allowing for the move to general residential in Kakanui and therefore going down to 300 square metre sections as against settlement zone minimum of 400 squares. There was a lot of feedback about the need to maintain the current character and open space and village feel. Do you have anxieties about it move to allocate or rezone some areas in Kakanui general residential and therefore smaller section size or not?
Mr. Campbell.
Again, this is kind of just reflecting what the National Planning Standard zoning template provides for, but until it's actually tested through a district plan, we won't know that, I guess, threshold for the community in Kakanui. So it might shift a little as a result of that. And again, it depends on whether people want to do that. Development doesn't force them to, it's just a minimum, really. So as we find now with a lot of minimums, they're really sort of achieved.
Yeah, just taking your point, Councillor Hopkins, there was a lot of pushback on that within the plan. I'm just wondering whether looking to national planning statements documents, there's an option to leave it at 400, or if that there's not really a true option in front of us right now. Interested in your take on that, Mr. Campbell.
Yeah, I guess critically it is the district plan that would set those lot sizes, so we can signal that it's going to be there or thereabouts through the new zoning, subject to whatever the district plan lands on, really.
Okay, so but saying that the settlement zone, I'm guessing that's covering a lot more than just Kakanui area. So it's changing the minimum lot size of the settlement zone, going to have wider implications.
Yeah, and each different township that has that current zoning will give us feedback on that through the district plan process. So some towns may want to go lower, some might want to keep it higher.
Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to add to that as well, the current settlement zone, the intention of the change in zoning in Kakanui is to change it from settlement zone to a general residential zone, which means that the settlement zone for the other areas in the district will remain sort of separate to that minimum lot size. It will be retained at, well, whatever what we've been talking about in terms of the district plan, sort of those lower smaller lot sizes for areas that are reticulated and larger lot sizes for unreticulated areas.
So essentially it is, just to clarify, the settlement zone, the main use change or the reason for changing to that usage is around the size of the lot, or is there other things as well? Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, it's also to ensure that any future commercial development is focused within the local centre zone area, which is where the sort of the existing shop and the community hall are at the moment. Whereas if it was a settlement zone, then that allows for much more dispersed development, commercial development throughout the entire township.
Okay, thank you. Right, councillors, any other questions on that one? Ruth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We were just going to add to that conversation. It was a little bit hard on Zoom to follow, but I think Katrina largely covered what we had to say, unless Briar wanted to add anything. Just letting you know, Briar is missing the raise hand function on Zoom, so I will raise it when we need to talk.
Thank you. Briar.
I think the only other thing we would raise, and it didn't come through in the submissions that we received, but through the engagement that we did with residents in Kakanui prior to the draft spatial plan going out, we did have conversations with the community about the character issue. And I think there probably is some further conversations needed there, which can happen through the district plan process, because I think even though that changing the zoning would reduce the lot size slightly, when we were questioning the community about what that might mean, we could get to a point where some of them were saying, well, you know, 50 additional houses wouldn't change the character in our opinion. That would be okay. So I think that question of character, I think there's probably a bit more work to do there with the community, I guess. And when we did ask, well, what is the tipping point and where is that threshold between what would fundamentally change the character versus what wouldn't, some of the community sort of said, well, we could get 50 more houses and that wouldn't change the character. That's okay. So that threshold for them is a little bit unclear still, I think. So yeah, we would just add that in.
Great, thank you. Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, this does raise a question to my mind. And it's quite an important question, actually. Okay, so the spatial plan is conceptual and high level, and it talks about using a mix of general residential and local centre zoning or settlement zone things. The key question then is, if that's going to be fleshed out and made real in the district plan, there will need to be maps. So are we going to have maps that would show the proposed general residential and local centre zoning or settlement zones in time for the draft district plan engagement later this year?
Katrina.
Great.
Oh, sorry, yes, I can acknowledge that we will, yes.
Thank you.
So in summary, then everyone will have an absolute opportunity to get right down to section one. Yeah, fine, great.
Right, so if there's nothing else on that one, we'll move on to number 7, which is remove potential greenfields growth area at Kakanoi to show areas to the north and south of Kakanoi as potential future urban expansion area with indicative medium to long-term staging. Is that clear what the intent is behind that, councillors, and is there any questions? No, right. So we'll move across the page to number 8, which is reduce the identified rural residential areas to already fragmented areas and areas adjoining the existing urban environment. Mr. Campbell.
Get a map up to help demonstrate what we're talking about here. So we did look quite closely, particularly that area out towards Western, at existing and I guess future development patterns. There's a lot of subdivision pressure there at the moment. So it hasn't reduced hugely to what was originally proposed, but it reflects what's happening on the ground really. So it makes sense to try and keep it fairly tight and picking up those lifestyle blocks, as we call them, in that northern area. So it's shrunk a wee bit to the northern extent, but it's still quite a decent area, but also trying to keep it kind of contiguous and following sensible boundaries in terms of roads and other features. There's also some little areas further south that again pick up largely the existing land pattern, but we're effectively not trying to rezone new future growth areas to a large extent because the community is telling us hold that back. We want to maybe have smaller lot sizes and some of that, and there's further work to be done on that in terms of servicing. But also we've got quite a lot of land we're showing for future residential growth as well. So this is only one part of the jigsaw in terms of accommodating future growth, but the community is saying, let's not keep producing more of this at the expense of our good rural land.
Right, is that clear, councillors? We'll move on to number 9, which is remove rural residential area. Sorry, councillor Hopkins.
Just a question. Yeah, I note that I think this is going to be contentious, especially if the amount of land identified as being currently zoned rural residential contracts, and it will. But I was just curious to know what you meant by, and how we would explain to the community if they asked, what does already fragmented area mean? Are we talking about areas where there's a bit of a number of different uses already happening inside I'm trying to work out, we want to reduce the identified rural residential areas to already fragmented areas and areas adjoining. The latter part makes absolute sense, but what do we mean by already fragmented areas, please?
Mr. Campbell.
Thanks. Yeah, that's largely to reflect that pattern of subdivision that's happened or is nearby to areas that are already subdivided. So you know, with quite limited parcels that could be used for rural use because of what's happening around them. So it's kind of a fragmentation in that area. So it's no longer a rural character, it's more rural residential. So it's quite a mix of things that contributes.
All right, so moving on to number 9, which is remove rural residential area identified in at Bushy Beach Road. So essentially it's saying that there was no support come through. Any submissions on that one? Councillor Holden.
Just that one stands out a little bit with the wording. There's no support when a lot of them it's engagement probably against. So how's that asked? There's
how engaging that to decide to take it out because there's no support? How was it asked?
Who would like to take that one? Katrina's just pulling that up by the looks of things. Councillor Hopkins.
I might be able to shed some light on that. My understanding is that that was something that went into the spatial plan at the request of the landowner or suggestion of the landowner, and it wasn't engaged on prior to the draft coming out. And when it was included, there was a lot of people then said, hey, no, what are you talking about? We don't want this. So in other words, it wasn't something that arose out of the community saying, let's do it. It was something that was introduced or included in the draft quite late at the suggestion of a very limited number of people. And when exposed to a wider audience, there was no enthusiasm for it. I noticed, Ruth, you got your hand up. Whether I'm right or wrong, I don't know, but I think that's how, as I remember things.
Ruth, do you want to say something to that?
Thanks, just through the chair. I think, I believe it first came up at stakeholder workshops. I'm not sure it was a particular landowner, but it was a suggestion from stakeholders, definitely. Was at that stage of the process.
Right, so when we say there's no support, does that mean that there was negative feedback on it, or does it mean that nobody really commented on it?
People sorry, you go, Brian, you talk.
No, I was going to say, where we got responses to that, we hadn't asked a specific question on Bushy Beach Road, but where people responded to the questions that were asked about rural residential land, and we had a couple of questions that were put out about that, there were some direct responses through that where we got comments saying no support for Bushy Beach Road. People listed cultural sensitivities and things like that for being reasons that it shouldn't be included, and so that's where we got people responding to the question.
Thank you. Right, councillors, any other questions on that one? Right, we'll move on to number 10, identify potential character areas where there may be a need for additional controls within the draft district plan to ensure any intensification responds appropriately to the character. Does staff want to expand on that at all? Thanks, Katrina.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, this is just in response to, in the draft spatial plan, we did identify a number of areas for which sort of meet the criteria under National Policy Statement for Urban Development for medium density development. Now, in response to that, there was a lot of concern that those areas do have a lot of character buildings and sort of amenity character within them. So this is just our response to that is that we will look at further studies as to whether there are areas within those medium density areas where we could look at further controls on the design and the height as well. So it's just acknowledging that that goes forward as something in the spatial plan as an action point.
So it's just asking you to do a bit more work in that area, essentially. Right. Is there any other questions on that one, councillors? Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, I guess my question to you guys is very simple. There has been some feedback, and again, I note that the response overall has been quite small, but we've had feedback about the implications of Objective 3 and Policy 5 in relation to height. And as I read the objectives and the policies, I think they give us a very wide discretion with regard to height. And we're certainly not compelled to say go up to 6 stories as is referenced in metropolitan or city centres. Do you guys agree that these policies don't confine us or oblige us to actually alight on any given particular height in relation to these areas?
Mr. Campbell.
Yes, I mean, the policies are to give you that option of tools, which include density, height, setbacks, all those type of things. So height is one factor we can control. And if you're looking at character areas, you might say, well, to retain the character, we might need to have a range of controls around what new builds might look like in that setting, whether it's height or setbacks as well. So.
Thank you. Sorry, Councillor Wallstein.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question on the, I read, like it must be enabled, but I was trying to find it, based on the refined accessibility and demand assessments. Can you give us any more information what these are? Because I've read somewhere else where it talks things like public transport, for example, but there's not much of that in Oamaru. So what are the refined accessibility and demand assessments?
Katrina, thank you.
So in terms of looking at where those medium density areas were, we would have looked at sort of distances from community facilities, shops, employment, local services. So this is just identifying that we still need to do further work in terms of supporting that evidence before anything sort of lands in the proposed district plan. So in between the draft district plan and the proposed district plan, then we're sort of signalling that we will be undertaking further work. I can see that Ruth has her hand up as well there, so she will probably be able to add to that. Thank you.
Through the chair, I will respond to this one. So I think I can probably shed light on a few different elements of just what the discussion has been so far. So in terms of the accessibility and demand analysis, that was done to inform the draft spatial plan. And there is, I don't have the page reference on me, but we can certainly circulate that after, where it does show some of the accessibility analysis that is done, and that will need to be refined further. That is fine for the purpose of what the spatial plan needs and identifying areas where we need to look at providing for intensification, but in terms of informing the specific heights and densities, there's a little bit more work that we will be doing to inform the draft district plan. But that accessibility, yes, there's no public transport in Oamaru, but it does, the accessibility component that we more look at is walking and cycling. So the ability, how far it is for people and what's acceptable in terms of New Zealand guidance around walking and cycling from a town centre, from local centres, and also to any community facilities or commercial activities. So we have looked at all of that, but the other component is also the demand. And in terms of that, we have to look at land values, house prices, where the desirable areas are versus others. And so we have used a range of data to look at that. I think I would then just say, in terms of the NPSUD requirements, in terms of Objective 3 and Policy 5, yes, it is very clear that it is about being enabling. And for Tier 3 councils such as Oamaru, the scope is open for you to set what is appropriate. But in saying that, it is very clear that the level of intensification that must be enabled has to be commensurate with your level of accessibility and demand. So if you have very high accessibility and there are areas where you can easily walk or cycle, the intention there is that your intensification level has to be commensurate with how accessible something is, or the degree to which the demand is. And when the NPSU was drafted, and I helped draft it, I think the intent was, yes, there wasn't going to be a blanket 6 stories set for Tier 3s, but you are looking at what is appropriate, and it is about creating affordable housing and really providing the market to be able to respond. And so the starting point should be, well, actually, is that level of intensification appropriate? What level of accessibility do we have, and going from there. And what that is suggesting in most councils across New Zealand is that the baseline that lots of councils will have, particularly Tier 3s, is probably slightly too low. That doesn't mean that you need to provide for skyscrapers or even go to 6 stories, but you do have to make sure that it matches how accessible you are. And so there are matrices that can help guide those heights. And I think the only other thing I would touch on is, even if there is character, the NPSUD guidance around intensification notes that character does not mean you don't intensify, and that you sort of need to work out, well, what is the level of intensification that can be provided before it fundamentally is going to impact the character. And are there other controls that can be put in the plan, sort of around design controls? That means you don't need to limit the height, but you can still build and be enabling without compromising that character.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Campbell.
Thanks. Just to quickly add to that, the original spatial plan had those kind of three key nodes, the north end with the commercial area and the intensity around that. And then obviously around the town centre here and a little bit out the south end of Oamaru, around those commercial areas. So it's quite discrete areas. It doesn't pick up anywhere where there may be a public transport route in future, because we just don't know that it would support that. And then importantly, it's saying new growth areas or outside those would still be at the lower densities. So people can build the standard sort of houses they're used to for families, larger sections. So it's really just saying where you have that proximity, a portion of the population might want to live closer to there and have less land and things to worry about. So we're kind of saying there's chunks of the town that would suit it, other parts will serve other needs because of their distance away, that type of thing.
And I guess again, this is asking for us to do a bit more work in that area. Councillor Hopkins.
Brian, I'm just wondering, listen, your explanation seems to me to be arguably contestable, particularly in relation to policy 5, which seems to me to be more pertinent to us than objective 3. And if you look at policy 5 of the MPSUD, it says that policy statements and district plans applying to tier 2 and 3 urban environments enable heights and density of urban form commensurate with the greater of the level of accessibility by existing or planned active or public transport, or 2, the relative demand for housing and business use. And I would have thought in almost every instance in Oamaru, it would be B that would be the greater of, because there's very little in the way of existing or planned active or public transport. And I would have thought that in most of the areas that we're looking at, the relative demand for housing would exceed the relative demand for business. So I would have thought that we're not going to be quite as shackled as some of your comments may have implied. What's your view?
Well, I think firstly, I would say that objective 3 is just as relevant as policy 5. You can't read policy 5 without objective 3. The two are a package and they go together. And yes, it is the greater of the level of accessibility and demand. And so there will be instances, for example, in South Hill, where that is quite steep. And so when you think about houses up at the top of South Hill, those are probably not so accessible in terms of if you were walking or cycling, but where that area does get picked up is the level of demand for housing, and that is demand relative to the demand across the rest of the district. And so the land values and the house prices are greater in that area versus other areas, and that is where that would get caught. In other areas like in and around your town centre, it is highly accessible. It may also have the demand factor, but in either case, where you have high demand or high accessibility, and whichever is the greater, you still must enable the intensification based on that. So as a council, you still have the requirement to go, well, which one is greater in particular areas? Is it the accessibility or is it the demand? And based on how high that might be, is the level of intensification that you must enable. So you still do have those requirements, and you still have to look at objective 3 with policy 5.
Councillor Hopkins.
Well, okay, fine, except I'm not sure that you could identify, if you look at objective 3, I'm not sure that A, B or C would particularly apply to Oamaru. But even if you decided that any of those 3 and objective 3 did, all objective 3 says is regional policy statements and district plans enable more people to live in. It doesn't say how many more. And I would argue that we would have discretion even in terms of the amount of intensification on the basis of how we interpreted objective 3. It doesn't specify that it has to be doubled or quadrupled or anything of the sort. It just says we've got to enable more people to live in certain areas. Now, more could be 3 more.
So Councillor Hopkins, just to, I guess, clarify this discussion a wee bit. So number 10 is talking about identifying potential character areas and basically where there may be need for additional controls. are you saying that on top of this here, you've got another thing you want us to go spend some time on around your intensification? I guess what's here from what I can read is still fair and reasonable, but are you talking that the underpinning intensification discussion we've had around the spatial plan is something you'd like to see shifting?
What I'm saying is that I think Briar, and I say this respectfully because clearly it's a subjective thing, and we'll never know until case law establishes who's right. But I think I think there is a possibility that you are making what we will have to do sound more menacing and draconian than it is. And I'm simply arguing that we have more discretion and more flexibility over matters like height and density than a sort of a stark interpretation of Objective 3 and Policy 5 might persuade the man or woman on the Clapham omnibus to believe. Okay. So all I'm saying is I just think it's not going to be as draconian, or the outcomes won't be as draconian as they may seem at the moment.
Brian or Ruth, did you still have your hand up there to respond?
Yeah, I think the only thing we would say there is we're not making it sound like it's a doom or gloom thing. We are simply outlining that there is a requirement for the council to enable intensification, and that does not mean that we are saying we are talking 6 stories having to be enabled everywhere. Probably more the level that you might be thinking of is something around 3 stories. All it's saying is that in those areas, it needs to be made sure that there is that level of intensification that is appropriate based on accessibility and demand. That doesn't mean we are talking what might apply in a tier 2 or 1 council being applied in Oamaru, because that is not the case. We just have to make sure that the requirements of the NPSUD are being met in terms of those areas where they are suitable to intensification, that is happening, but within the context of Oamaru and the growth and level of development there as well.
Thank you. Right, I'm just trying to get a bit of a move forward on this, Councillor Hopkins. So just, I guess, if I can get you to have a look at what we've got with number 10, and we will move through the document, but we need to have a think about whether there's anything else that, after we've gone through 1 to 11, that you feel the need to add to test the waters on that one. Does that sound fair? Yeah. Okay. Right, so we'll move on, councillors, to number 11, which is update the action plan to include upgrading Kakanoi Bridge, investigation of a heavy vehicle route through Oamaru, and investigation of a dedicated over-dimension route. Does anyone need any clarification on any of that? Councillor Hopkins.
Well, look, my view is that we shouldn't put things in the spatial plan that we don't have ownership and control over. Now, yes, we can investigate a heavy vehicle route through Oamaru. That makes perfect sense. We may be able to investigate a dedicated over dimension route, although why we would do that when we're investigating the heavy vehicle route puzzles me a tad. I'm not sure we should put upgrading the Kakanui Bridge in there, not because we don't want it, let's be clear, but because this council has decided as of now that it cannot afford to build that bridge without Waka Kotahi subsidy, and Waka Kotahi to date has repeatedly said you're not getting it. So I'm not sure what the point of putting it in the spatial plan, given that the key funding partner won't come to the party. I'm not sure what that achieves. I don't think we should do it.
If I can respond to that, first of all, this isn't just like we are looking at adopting this plan for sure, but it's wider than just council. It is our community's spatial plan and how we want to grow and how we want to do things. So I think to ignore the Kakanoi Bridge discussion and not have that as any set of direction doesn't show any support for it when we're going to Waka Kotahi. And so if we actually want to sort of show that we've got our council behind, I think that becomes increasingly important to be shown in our spatial plan as a planned direction that a council's taking on. Also, Wakatohi hasn't actually turned down funding. They keep pushing back our timeframes for sure. They've not said that it's not going to happen, and it is still on the books. So I think we need to show support for that direction as a community. And I think that it's come through quite clearly in the submissions in support of that as well. So, Mayor Kircher.
Thank you. And yeah, I'd certainly agree that it's better to have it in it, because if we're having these arguments with Waka Kotahi or any other funders around, this is what we want, being able to point to something that says this is what our community wants is also important. And it may be that the community does want a 2-lane bridge, and we know we are going to struggle to fund a 1-lane bridge. Well, Waka Kotahi is going to be challenged to fund their half of that. But I guess it just really depends on what we want to put in, whether that we're specific about 1 or 2 lanes. As far as the heavy vehicle route, to my understanding, we've pretty much done that already, and potentially it could be shown in there. We probably could be specific about that. We've discussed a bypass, and the reality is it's just not feasible. There's no reasonable route to be able to take, particularly heavy vehicles, but all other traffic to bypass on Oamaru. So, we just don't see that as part of it. So it's actually being clear, if we're not going to have that we aren't having it, and that we need to make sure that as we develop the Oamaru area and so on, we've got to be mindful that this is, unless something else pops up to allow it to happen, this is where all the traffic that goes from north and south is going to pass through. So okay with putting all of those things in, but also whether we're actually explicit about we're not having, we're not considering a bypass because of the lack of viability for one. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mayor Kircher. Right, if there's no other questions on that part, recognising that we've still got to cover the officer recommended changes to the spatial plan and anything else councillors want to bring up, I might actually go back to and start voting on the ones under number 2, which is your 1 to 11. So we'll take them one at a time, and I think that'd just be a good way to get those ones ticked off in a direction on those, and then we can move through into the other general feedback. People happy with that? So do I have anyone that's willing to move the number 1 on the growth predictions? Councillor Thompson, we have a seconder there.
Oh.
Councillor Hopkins, right, is there any discussion on that one? Mayor Kircher.
Yeah, it's always a difficult one, and I think if you ask the people on Kapiti Coast, with their predictions 5 years ago, were anywhere near what they're experiencing at the moment, they'll probably say no. The number is the number, and it's better to make sure we are planning for growth and we're doing the things for growth, whether it's around 3,000 people or 2,000 people or 4,000 people. It's those are pretty small differences in the greater scheme of things. So certainly support making sure we're trying to be as realistic as possible. But yeah, we want to make sure that we are planning properly.
And just, I guess, the use of most recently available information, just recognising the conversation we had around that and what information can feed into that moving forward into the council meeting later on. Councillor Hopkins.
I mean, if it's going to go as a vote, depending on whether this movement would agree, that could be amended slightly where to update the growth predictions to reflect more recently available information, including but not limited to 2018 census data. Because we've heard from one or another that there are other sources that we should be relying on to influence.
Well, I think most recently available information still covers that. We're not classifying, we're not saying that it has to be census data, and I think we're sending a clear signal to staff as to what the expectation is around that. If the mover is still comfortable with the wording as it is. Right, so I'll put that. All in favour, please say aye. And against? That's carried. Number 2, use of more plain English. Do we have a mover for that? Councillor Williams, a seconder, Councillor Hopkins. Is there any discussion on that? I think that's clear. So all in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And against? That's carried. Number 3, and again, looking at the removal of council land in reserves and just making it council reserves. Moved councillor Halalili. Do I have a seconder there? Councillor Williams. Right, any other-
So just a point of clarification, so remove the proposal to explore alternative uses for council reserves, is that what it would now be?
for council reserves, yes. Right, any discussion on that, councillors?
Yes.
Councillor Hopkins.
I'll speak to that, Madam Chair, if I may
Can you put your mic on, councillor Hopkins?
I'll speak to that if I may. Look, the authors of the draft themselves and the report to us say that the question was possibly badly worded and the maps were misleading or persuaded people to form a view that was not intended when the question was framed. I would just draw councillors' attention to what actually was said in the draft. Potential redevelopment of parts of underutilised reserve or council land. The reserves identified for potential redevelopment are strategically located close to the town centre amenities and services. This redevelopment may look to use some of the more suitable parts of these reserves for housing, whilst retaining functional portions of the open space and upgrading these with the profit from any housing for leisure, recreational and ecological uses. This may also support upgrades to other reserves across Oamaru. Further discussions with the community and more detailed analysis around the potential for this will be required. Now, given that any reserve, if it's to change use, there must be a formal consultation process anyway, and I think it's required under the Act to last for 3 months. And given that the community, other submissions in this tell us that people want more housing choice, affordable housing, one of the few resources to which the council has access that may enable us to build community housing or facilitate affordable housing is our own land. And I don't believe we should absolutely, categorically, unequivocally take reconsideration and possible use of parts of undeveloped reserve off the table absolutely. I know we've removed a bit about council land, but I believe we just have to have honest conversations with the community. Keep on saying we want this, we want that, we want this, we want something else. How are we going to pay for it? We can chuck another 7% on the rates every year if you want, or we can find other ways to fund things and do things. And if there's to be an imaginative and creative future for local government, it starts with us. We don't wait for the government to tell us how we can lead the future of local, or be the future of local government. We should be that ourselves, and reserving options and having honest conversations with the community about alternatives and funding sources is part of that. So I personally will vote against this, although I suspect it will be carried. But I would urge other councillors to retain it as an option, even if it's one that's only considered 10 years from now or 5. But I don't believe it should be removed absolutely at this point.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult one, and you know, you only need to look through a lot of the responses, and they talk about losing reserves, and there was never an intention for any reserves to be lost. We were talking about small parts of it, but we did word that badly. We didn't communicate it well enough, and as much as you've read out what was actually written, I don't know how many people actually read that. And some people were philosophically opposed to losing any reserve space at all, and that's fine. But equally, people from their responses felt we were going to get rid of whole reserves. And that was unfortunate. And I think probably the only way around that would have actually been more clear around, okay, there's this very small part here, which is never used by anyone, and it's out of the way and so forth, that could have 3 houses put on it, for example, and then that money could go to actually making all of our reserves better. You know, I still point out the fact that pretty much once you get past Eden Street and the reserve, the Glenwarren and Glen Eden reserves, there is very little north of that, and we've got half our population actually north of that area, and they do not have the same access to reserves. And it would have been great to have got funding that actually is able to help us expand a green belt, if you like, but certainly put reserves into areas where there's no easy access, and and we're actually, there's a reasonable part of our population don't have the same vehicle access and so on to some of these things. The aspiration of actually having more reserves, which anyone wherever they live in Oamaru, for example, would be able to walk to and go and enjoy a bit of nature and so on, would be great. And I think we've lost that opportunity in this discussion because we haven't actually done the job well enough of explaining what we were talking about. It's not to stop it being had again, because I mean, spatial plans need to be dynamic. They need to be able to change. They need to be living documents and so on. And some of those opportunities may be there in the future, but for now, we didn't do the job well enough in explaining ourselves. And I don't think people really appreciate just actually how much we actually value reserves. And I think every single one of us around this table appreciates what we do have and don't want to lose that network of reserves. We actually want to increase it. Anyway, I'll be voting in favour of the motion. Thank you.
Councillor Williams.
Yeah, I agree with what most of the mayor said, but I'd just like to speak in support of our staff. I don't necessarily think that everything was badly worded. It's that particular aspect of the document was grabbed upon and by certain factors in society, and the wording was changed, and it all got turned into some kind of campaign to highlight an issue that, of course, is very dear to many people's hearts in this town. So, unfortunately, there wasn't a lot we could do to stop it. But yeah, I think as long as around this table with the discussions that we've got coming up in the near future that are related to the same topic, that we do look into how much weight we put on certain aspects that come back to us when we know that there has been a major misinformation campaign put out there that can alter how we end up doing things around this table, then we're still doing our job properly. But yeah.
Councillor Halalele.
Thank you. Are you proposing to remove number 3?
I've said I would work against it because it's been moved that we remove that. Well, as it stands, the new thing will be simply that we remove the proposal to explore alternative uses for council land.
Reserves.
I'm just saying that I'm totally regret the fact that you're taking reserves out.
Your microphone's off, but you referred to council land, but the motion refers to council reserves.
Just a point of clarification, as I understand it, what was moved was an amended version of what's in front of us as number 3. And what's been moved was remove that we support the proposal, or we retain the proposal to explore alternative uses for council land. What I've said by way of my speaking is that I think it's
You're confusing the picture a wee bit. So just to make it really clear, where the recommendation is to remove the proposal to explore alternative uses for council reserves. So just so we're clear on that.
Well, then I was speaking to it.
Thank you.
I was speaking to it and I will vote against it.
Councillor Halalele, did you have anything else to add to that?
No, because I actually agree, like with what you were talking about in terms of both council land and reserves, and that, we could have framed it a bit better to help better understand it. But at the end of the day, it's our decision, what we decide. I was just inquiring whether you were putting forward a second motion to cancel 3 altogether.
Well, I think that would have to be through a loss recommendation, because that is and contradicts what's been moved at the moment. So we'll just have to let that pass. Mr. Campbell.
Thank you. Just to again clarify, the recommendation is to take out that action item out of the spatial plan. It doesn't mean that council can't revisit that through other media, such as reserve management plans or other things, e.g. Forester Heights that we're doing at the moment. So, and it also takes it off the maps. So what it's kind of suggesting is that this document is probably not the right place for that discussion maybe to happen. It's signaled that it was something to consult on. We got feedback. Let's park it, take it out of here, have it as a discussion elsewhere. It doesn't negate or take away the ability to have that discussion. It's just not referred to in the spatial plan as a key thing we're going to do as part of this document.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. And I think that, again, it's just recognising that in the short term, there hasn't been the community support for that, and it may not have been explained as well. I guess that's the challenge we have when we're talking about something at a very high level, strategic kind of level, when we can talk about what we mean, but when what the community kind of looks for very much is the detail sitting in behind it. And so maybe, you know, discussing like this in the future, if we're going to discuss it at high level, needs to have the underpinning detail behind it, which may move us out of the strategic place, but I think it's actually the only way for our community to understand it in its entirety to what we're trying to achieve. So we've set very high level, but I guess that the idea that this doesn't feed into the future for local government, and I get the issues we have around community housing. So there's certainly that side of things, but also part of community-led development is taking your community with you. And in this occasion, we haven't done that at this stage, and that needs a lot more work. So that's why I'll be supporting this, Councillor Hopkins.
Just a point of clarification, and I would feel more comfortable if, and maybe the movement seconder would entertain this.
No, Councillor Hopkins, I'm sorry, you've spoken.
I was going to ask a question. Listen, picking up on what Mr. Campbell said, is it possible for this to specify what the proposal is, which is, I think, action 51?
Well, I guess the recommendation could be elaborated on to specify exactly what it's referring to in the document.
I think we're offering our staff a general direction on this, and I think it's clear. So as long as is the mover comfortable with the current wording, because I think it is clear what we're talking about here. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My concern is around the perception of us backing away or being prepared to politically withdraw from this, when in actual fact, the feedback has been the result of misinterpretation of the information. And I'd much rather prefer for it to be left on the table, because it is something in the future that we have to deal with.
All right, do we have any other speakers? No, so are we clear that we're discussing the removal, to remove the proposal to explore alternative uses for council reserves? Are staff clear on what we mean by that? Let's nod to the other end of the table. Right, well, we'll put that. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And against?
No.
Right, we might do a show of hands on that one. Okay, we'll do again. All in favour, please raise your hand. And 2. It's 4. And against? And 2. So it's 4 to 2. So that is passed.
Madam Chair, could I just offer a clarification, because Councillor Williams pointed out, I might not have been very clear. When I say about the wording that we had, it was councillors approved what went out, and I was not wanting to be criticising staff at all. We approved what went out, and we weren't clear enough in that, and that's why we've ended up where we are. But I just appreciate that, yeah, that people do understand that.
Future. Right, so move to number 4. We're going to have to move through these a wee bit quicker, but it's around investigating possible locations for a potential youth centre. Do I have someone willing to move that? Councillor Halalali, and seconded Councillor Thompson. Right, any discussion there? Right, well, I'll put that. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And against? That's carried. Number 5 is moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded Mayor Kircher. Any discussion on that? Right, I'll put that. All in favour, please say aye. And against? That's carried. So number 6, which is around the zoning on Kakanui. It's moved by Councillor Hopkins. Do I have a seconder there? Okay, that's seconded by Mayor Kircher. Right, so comments. Does anyone have any comments to make around that? Right, no, I'll put that. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And against? That's carried. Move on to number 7, which is removal of the potential greenfield growth area at Kakanui. Councillor Hopkins.
Perhaps should have asked this, in fact, I certainly should have asked this question before and apologise for not doing so. As I understand what we're about to vote on, it will take away that area at the south of Kakanui that some people said was floodplain anyway, but it will take it away as a specified and identified area of expansion. But it won't take that or other areas off the table as possibilities at some point in the future, should the need arise. Have I read that correctly? Because we're removing a potential greenfield growth area, but we are retaining potential future urban areas with indicative medium to long-term state.
Yes, that's correct, Councillor Hopkins. There's still some areas for longer term growth in Kakanui signalled at both north and south as a refinement of that.
Yeah, I think it's just to say the community didn't support at this stage, and there's probably other areas that I've had plenty of people point me in the direction of as well. So maybe it's just more work needs done in this area for future growth.
Oh, absolutely, I agree with you. The pushback against having that particular area identified was really strong in the Kakanui community drop-in day.
All right, so do I have someone willing to move that? I'll move that from the chair. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Hopkins. And just speaking to that, yeah, I don't think the community is ready for that, but there is certainly a number of builders and other people that do recognise that there is a need to have this conversation. So I think we just need to continue the conversation. We also need to remember that if we don't allow the township to grow at all, that's going to end up driving up prices and making it probably very much a holiday destination that a lot of locals can't afford to actually buy in and live in, which is problematic. And obviously you've got a wee school there that's reliant on the local population and shops and bits and pieces. So I think when you look at a community and you want to keep the community aspect rather than just have the holiday aspect, you need to make sure you keep it relatively affordable. And that does involve allowing for some portion of growth. So I hope that it's a conversation we keep having, but I just don't think we're quite there yet. Mayor Kircher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This does epitomise that challenge that we have around, as governors, trying to identify areas where it makes sense to allow growth to happen and to make sure that we're catering for that, and you don't end up with I'm not accusing everyone there of a NIMBYism, but it essentially is that type of situation where, well, we don't actually want more people here. Well, if your wastewater scheme or your water scheme or whatever other services you have become unaffordable because we haven't got extra people helping to pay for them, that's going to be a consequence. If we've got demand for housing but no land to put it on, as you say, that drives the price up and makes things less affordable, and then you don't have the local families being able to buy into those communities. You do end up with only well-off people buying them, or people buying holiday homes there and creating non-resident ratepayers, which doesn't help the local schools and dairy throughout the year and so on. So there's those challenges that we have, and it's, I'm only supporting this because it does reflect the feedback that we've had, but also that we do have some areas that can still be built in there. But, if we do not make sure that we're providing space, you end up with inappropriate development, and people, looking for resource consent to subdivide land that's not zoned appropriately, that may not be the best area to have housing. It may be in the coastal strip and so on, in the coastal zone. But that's driven because there's not good building sites anywhere else. And so we do have to be mindful of that. But for the time being, I'll vote for this one.
All right, any other speakers, councillors? Right, I'll put that. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And against? That's carried. Move on to number 8, which is reduce the identified rural residential areas to already met fragmented areas and areas adjoining the existing urban development. Do I have a mover for that? Councillor Hopkins. A seconder? Yep, Councillor Thompson. Right, any discussion on that? Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, speaking to this one, Madam Chair, it's interesting. I do come back to the fact that we did get, relative to the total number of people affected by the spatial plan, a very small number of responses. But the question about rural residential and having less was only answered by 128 people. 77 of them said yes, they did want less rural residential area, but 51 said no, they didn't. Oddly enough, the next question about smaller lot sizes, they got more answers, perhaps because people thought it was didn't only relate to rural residential. But I think we have to do this, and I think we have to try and persuade the community that it's necessary, not only because there is feedback within the community about preventing sprawl and the like, but also because the National Policy Statement on the productive soils is going to actually to some extent compel it. Well, not to some extent, it will compel us. The only question is exactly how, and we don't know that yet, but we have been told that National Policy Statement is due out in the next month or two. So it is going to have an impact on us, and it is going to have an impact on the community, and it will change the zoning and the value of some areas of land currently identified as rural residential. My view is that the key thing will be to essentially achieve some form of fiscal equity. So if there's a reduced area, there is still some opportunity for people who might own that land to have greater development opportunities by way of smaller section sizes, which would offset the loss elsewhere. But I'm just flagging that this is going to be a contentious matter and there will be pushback on it. And I think we really have to start explaining to people ASAP, starting now, why we're looking at it.
Right, any other speakers to that? I'll put that. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And against?
No.
Okay, that's carried. Move on to removing rural residential area at Bushy Beach Road. Moved Councillor Hopkins. Do I have a seconder? Seconder Councillor Williams. Right, any discussion on that? Councillor Holding.
I'll just flag that I would like to see some more information of why it be removed. I just don't think it's got enough. Everything else is quite well explained, but that one doesn't really give much to decide on.
Right, so if we can get staff when it comes back to council to have just a bit more information underpinning that, is that viable? Perfect. Right, Mayor Kircher.
Yeah, I don't agree with this, and Councillor Holding's actually covered pretty much the concern. You know, saying it's understood that it's cultural sensitivity. So, you know, we don't know what they are. We don't know, you know, where did that information come from, and you know, does cultural sensitivity such that it means there shouldn't be any houses there, or is there other aspects that need to be noted? So it's, you know, it just doesn't give enough information. We definitely need that. But so until we have that, I won't support this one.
Councillor Hopkins.
Well, just speaking to this, those of you who will remember the maps will remember, I think, that this particular area that was identified as possibly able to be used for rural residential was a sizable area of land physically separated from the town boundary. And I have a feeling that might have been why people responded negatively when they saw it. My own view is there was a possibility, and it may emerge during the district plan through submissions, that there was a possibility to kind of amend the southeastern town boundary at the top of Bushy Beach Road But this proposal was for a very sizable area of land, physically discrete from the town itself. And for that reason, I picked up some of the drop-ins opposition to it, and it was universal from my experience.
Thank you. Any other speakers? So I think I'm probably going to vote against this too, just based on the comments of the Mayor and Councillor Holding. And just if it does lose, just request that it's retained in the spatial plan until we've had some more information come to council to explain the reasonings behind it. So we'll just see where that gets to. Right, Councillor Hopkins, did you want to write a reply there?
Well, I do. We're entitled to, perhaps if councillors want more information, then rather than, well, we can test the resolution, or alternatively, we could amend it and seek at this stage that the matter becomes one where we get more information before we resolve it. I would like to think when councillors, when they see the map, would think no, because it would be a radical change of that area between the town boundary as it currently exists and the end of Bushy Beach Road, where which is now a car park for people who want to go down and look at the penguins and the like, and is widely visited by people for those purposes. It would radically transform the character of that area. And it was a sizable piece of land allocated for this purpose. And it might be better if we're uncertain as to why the recommendation to remove it exists. It might be better for it to be a matter that we get more information on rather than vote on today. I really think it would be prudent to perhaps take that approach.
Okay, now I know that you've had to write a reply, but Councillor Williams hasn't had a chance to speak and sort of changed a wee bit the discussion. So I'll pass over to Councillor Williams.
Just to speak in support of what Councillor Hopkins just said, it radically change the area is definitely the words that I would use. At the moment, they can subdivide there down to 4 hectares. If we go and change that to, I can see their concern. If we change that to rural residential, we're talking about 1 hectare, which we're looking at reducing the size of potentially down to half a hectare. That area would radically change, and I can see why it caused some concern out there and why there was some pushback to that area changing that much. So I definitely am speaking in favour of our motion.
Right, well, I'll put that as it is now. So it's around removal of residential area identified at Bushy Beach Road. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And against?
No.
No. Right, I'll just do a show of hands on that one. All in favour, hands up. Right, there's 3 in favour and against. There's 3 against. So that means that, well, how about we just leave that as it doesn't get removed at this stage until there's more information. So that comes back to council to be decided with information attached at the council meeting. Are staff comfortable with that?
Yeah. Madam Chair, through you, could I just ask councillors who choose to abstain to advise us if they do so, please?
We just need to remember there's a number of councillors here that aren't on the committee. So we're lucky to have as many councillors as we do today.
Forgive me, I apologize. Make my hand
And we're possibly having people vote that aren't part of the committee too. Right.
Sorry.
Right, so we'll leave that one and move on to number 10, which is identify potential character areas where there may be a need for additional controls within the draft district plan.
Happy to move that one.
Right, moved Councillor Hopkins. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Thompson. Any discussion? Right, all in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And against? That's carried. And then moving on to number 11, around updating the plan with the Kakanoi Bridge, the heavy vehicle route and the over dimension route. Do we have a mover? Moved Councillor Hopkins. Seconder. Mayor Kircher, right, any discussion? Councillor
Just very briefly, having suggested initially that the upgrade of the Kakanui Bridge shouldn't be there for the reasons I gave, I was absolutely and totally persuaded by the arguments of the Mayor and yourself. Hence, I'm happy to move it. So yes, it should stay in.
Thank you. Right, any other speakers? Right, I'll put that. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Oh, sorry, against? That's carried. Apology, Mr. Cook, I seen your hand halfway through that voting there. Is anything you'd like to add to that discussion?
I just wanted to clarify during the discussion, the mayor raised the note about formally documenting that we're not considering a bypass and whether that was to be included in the document or not.
But this stage, it is included in the recommendation. And so I guess the only way that will be removed at this stage is if it gets removed through the council side of things. All right, so we'll move on to number 3. There's quite a number here. We'll just walk through them and then I'll put them all together, but we'll try and panel beat any changes that we need to make unless it becomes obvious that some need to be put separately. So remove references to draft, proposed in the consultation questions, a 4-word by the Runaka, update the mana whenua statement.
Just a question about that, Madam Chair. When have we been given a time when we might expect that? Because clearly this is going to council reasonably soon. It would be good to have the document out ASAP after that. So do we know when the Runaka are likely to give us the updated mana whenua statement, please?
Katrina.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In terms of the forward introductory statement, we have already received that from Runaka. I can actually share a copy of that with you today. It's more of a, I think it's a mihi. And in terms of the mana whenua statement, that was in the original draft plan, that we have received comments from Runaka on that and have the updates ready to present. We'll have the updates ready to present at the final council meeting.
Councillor Hopkins.
Supplementary question. I presume it will be their statement. So in other words, I'm assuming that we will accept it in its totality rather than debate it or discuss its particulars. Would it, or do you imagine that we would have some role to play in that regard?
Through the chair, my understanding is that the changes that have come through are minor, just in terms of some terminology and referencing, just correcting some spelling. But I would ask if Briar or Ruth may want to expand on that because they've had the versions.
Just recognising we're probably going to be a bit short on time. So if you're comfortable with where we're at, Councillor Hopkins, we'll move forward. I just wonder whether staff want to walk through a lot of these because most of it is management stuff. So it's probably going to be quicker if you walk through and explain anything that needs explained. Are you happy to do that? Thanks, Katrina.
I'm happy to take you through that. Thank you, Chair. Yes, so point D is just update the process section. So that's just to further provide additional amendments to update on the actual process that's taken place to date to allow for the workshops and the meeting today. The infill residential areas, that was just areas that were identified on the spatial plan maps, which are already addressed through the general residential zone provisions. So they're unnecessary in terms of the actual spatial plan mapping. In terms of the point F, include more detail on potential staging of growth areas. That's addressing the next 30 years as opposed to only decade 1, which it did in the draft plan. In terms of remove any reference to zones on the maps, just in terms of clarification to differentiate the spatial plan from the district plan. It's probably better in the spatial plan just to refer to those general residential areas, settlement areas, rather than actual zones. So there's no confusion between which plan actually contains the zone maps. And then we have point H, which is including several small areas that are currently zoned rural residential in the operative district plan. But in consequential discussions with our infrastructure team, they advise that these can be readily serviced. So through the draft district plan, we would be identifying these areas as potential for residential zone. Point I there is to amend the draft the spatial plan to refer to Forester Heights as residential zoning, which reflects the operative plan, current operative plan, district plan zoning. Also,
just to check on that one, because obviously we've got a discussion happening around that, and I just want to make it clear that we're not making this change in order to bypass any other process. So whether or not that has to, have a comment to the process sitting outside, and that this is just the current zoning of the area. I just think we've got to be careful. It doesn't look like we're trying to push something through quietly, because that's not the intention of the change here. Thank you.
And then point J is in terms of adding in a provision within the action plan that the spatial plan is reviewed every 6 years or thereabouts, just to acknowledge that it is a living document and it's not static and set in stone. Also to update the consultation summary page to reflect the October and November engagement process that we undertook, to correct the spelling of Airedale Road, and to make any further consequential changes just in terms of cross-referencing to reflect all the changes or recommendations that have been made at today's meeting. And then just the last points there is just acknowledging that there is national guidance that is sort of emerging at the moment, and that there may well, that this just provides for the opportunity to make small tweaks to align with those changes.
Perfect, thank you. Now we've got obviously A to M and then A, B, C. I'll take those separately. For A to M, is there anything that councillors would like to be put separately? Right, so do I have a mover for that? Councillor Hopkins, do I have a seconder? Councillor Thompson. Right, any discussion on any of that, councillors? Right, well, I'll put that. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And against? That's carried. So that's it.
Chair, just in the interest of time, I think we probably need to turn the statements or the paragraph at the top of the next page into a resolution.
Yeah.
So I suggest that what I would like to move is that we approve further minor amendments following a review of A, B, and C.
Okay.
So I'll move that.
Did you get that, Ainsley? Right, so we have a seconder. Councillor Thompson, thank you. Right, any questions on that one, councillors? Right, I'll put, sorry, any future?
Yeah, just a question. Sorry, just trying to get my head around this. The following areas are also suggested for further review, which may result in some further minor amendments. So are all of those assumed that the amendments will be dictated to us rather than that we've got any choice on them?
Oh, okay. Well, good question. That we move that we accept further minor amendments for approval following a review of A, B, and C.
Okay,
So in other words, they would come from this committee, although we don't have them at the moment, but they would go to the council, which would then have the opportunity to vote. That's right.
Yeah, Councillor Thompson as seconder, you're comfortable with that? Right, does that answer your question, Kucha?
Near enough. Thank you.
Great. I'll put that. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And against? That's carried. And I just putting out there if there's any other things that any councillors wanted to raise or move.
Do we go back to the original recommendation, Madam Chair?
Mr. Cook, I'll just take your question there.
Just in response dealing with item number 9, which was the Bushy Beach decision, And I wonder whether it would be appropriate, and I'm not sure, whether we should bring that back to the next CCR committee, which falls between now and the council meeting, so we can get that dealt with. That will make the council meeting potentially easier to approve the document, but I'd take your guidance on that.
I think that would be a good move. So if we can do that, you don't need a recommendation for that, you can just action that, perfect. Right, so we will go back to the recommendation 1, which is that council adopts the Oamaru Western and Kakanoi spatial plan, which includes all amendments detailed in as resolved in today's meeting, incorporating feedback from key stakeholders and communities. Right, moved Mayor Kircher. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Hopkins. Right, any other comment on that?
Well, just,
Councillor Hopkins, you don't have your mic on.
Sorry, Madam Chair, we're not moving that council adopts it. We're actually, the committee is recommending the council adopts it. But I think just to be absolutely clear, which includes all the amendments detailed in this report, incorporating feedback from key stakeholders and communities, and as agreed at this meeting, at the committee, at the CCR meeting.
Comfortable with that, Mayor Kircher?
I wasn't listening. Yeah, sure.
Right, good. Right, so based on that, do we have any other comments? No, well, I'll put that. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And against, that's carried. And that brings us to the end of our meeting. Thank you, councillors. Aye. And I'll declare the meeting closed, and thanks for those watching on the live stream.